Hey y'all, it's me. It's your girl, and you already know it. Like, share, and subscribe. What's up, real deal? What's up? Hope everybody's staying positive and cool. Don't let the negative bring you down. Lift it back up with something positive, okay? Just keep positive. They'll stop. But look, y'all, anyway, we're going to stay positive with our content today. We on day 10 of Henry Dinkins' trial. He's on trial right now, y'all. And look, Dinkins. Got to get it together, baby. But so what we're going to do now, we're going to go on and start with finishing out with the detective. He don't take on the stand testifying against Henry Dinkins, okay? Let's pay his body language and his emotions some attention, y'all, okay?
Officer Pfeiffer, I swear you in again. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
I do.
I was alerted. I know, Mr. Freeze, you're going to start your cross-examination, but it's my understanding the state would like to reopen its direct examination. Is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
Any objection?
Mr. Cunningham, talk to me. I have no objection, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Freeze. You may proceed.
Thank you. Sergeant Pfeiffer, I just had two additional topics that I wanted to discuss with you. When you went out to the area of Kunow Implement on the evening of March 22nd of 2021, there along 270th Avenue, how would you describe the lighting conditions, if you recall?
On the initial night,
Yes.
it was just becoming dark.
Okay. Were you there well after dark?
Yes.
And then as far as lighting in that area, is there any type of street lights in that area after dark? Well, are there any street lights, or is it a rural area that you only have the natural lighting that you would see at night?
It is very rural. There was no lighting near where I was.
Okay, thank you. Additionally, after the Laceer Comanche was recovered from the pond, did you direct a firearms trace to be conducted on that firearm?
Yes, I did.
Explain.
I submitted the serial number to our gun investigation unit. And at that time, Detective Nathan Thomas of our gun unit submitted it to the portal where those trace searches are done for serial numbers on firearms.
Okay. How does that process work?
The serial numbers are tracked in the ATF database based off of the 4473 ATF form that is filled out when a person purchases a firearm from a FFL dealer.
And so before you take that a step further, if an individual goes into a business to purchase a firearm, what does that process look like?
So you have to present your identification card of who you are. You complete the 4473 ATF form, which has a long list of questions. They cover your status of if you're a felon, addicted to controlled substances. There's many questions, but they're of that nature to basically see if you're capable of possessing a firearm. That firearm, although filled out electronically, it is stored locally at those each FFL dealers. The information regarding the serial number and the purchase with very limited transaction information is then forwarded to the ATF. So upon making these e-trace searches for serial numbers on firearms, we obtain very aggregate information, and it results in the location of the FFL dealer that last had a recorded sale of a particular firearm. From that point, investigators would have to respond to that particular location to obtain a physical copy of those forms.
Okay, so then the last point of sale, if a firearm had been acquired legally, is that where the documentation is going to be located?
Yes.
All right. In this particular case, were those steps followed for the Laceer Comanche with the serial number?
Had informed us that the shop in Iowa City, Iowa, who had handled that last recorded transaction had gone out of business in 2014, and the records were being moved to a different owner of that store. It was relayed to me through emails and through Agent Pessman that there was records that they believed were lost in a flood that took place in the Iowa City and Cedar Rapids area, and I believe it was 2009.
All right, thank you. Your Honor, may the record reflect that I previously provided counsel a copy of State's Exhibit 155. May I approach the witness?
You may.
I'm going to use State's Exhibit 155 for purposes of identification. Do you recognize State's Exhibit 155?
Yes, Exhibit 155 is the results of the e-trace for the Laceer Comanche 238 special revolver.
Okay. In this particular firearms trace summary, does it speak to the issue of the wholesaler or retailer no longer being in business?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And does this apply to the gun that we're talking about?
Yes, it does. The serial number depicted on this trace form is 184998.
Your Honor, the state would move to introduce State's Exhibit 155.
No objection.
That exhibit will be admitted.
The state has no further questions, Your Honor.
Ms. Cunningham, if you could just hang on to that for a short bit, I want to use that. Detective Pfeiffer, looking at State's Exhibit 155, that indicates that this Laceer 38 revolver came into the hands of the dealer in November of 2007, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, the firearm that was tested was a Laceer 38 Special Comanche revolver, right?
Yes, sir.
And you have no records, no reports that this firearm was ever stolen. Is that
Correct.
true?
Correct.
You inspected the firearm. You saw a serial number, correct?
Correct.
So the serial number was not obliterated.
No.
No one ever reported this firearm used in a crime prior to this one, correct?
That's correct.
So the signs that we look for weapons being previously used in a crime, filed off serial numbers, stolen firearms, things of that nature, those weren't present here, were they?
No, they were not.
Okay. So for purposes of this record, this firearm was legally possessed up until the time you ran the check on April 6, 2021, right?
There's no information to say otherwise.
Was a llama revolver ever recovered in this investigation?
I don't know one off the top of my head. Do you have a location or anything more specific?
No, I'm just asking in general. Do you know what the firearm brand llama is?
I have not heard of it, no.
Okay. Now, why was the FBI brought in on this investigation?
In the initial phases of this case, there was members of the police command and administration busy trying to figure out where resources were going to come from. We were in a time of COVID staffing issues and dealing with staffing shortages within our own local agency. There were powers that be from well above my pay grade, and they began reaching out for the best advice early on while I was still out in the field. And upon my return to the office that day, I was informed that the FBI was contacted by police command, and they were going to be responding on some sort of level.
To the best of your knowledge, did the FBI get contacted because of the resources that they have that perhaps local police did not have?
I believe that's part of it.
Yeah.
And the protocol and the testing equipment they may have that local or state police may not have?
It's possible, yeah.
Absolutely.
Fair for me to say that when items are sent off to the FBI crime lab for testing at Quantico, that we're sending items for testing at a place where, frankly, we have the best of the best in the country?
Yes.
Okay. Were you the point of contact or the liaison between local police and the FBI?
For many things, some of it existed in the upper command ranks of the agency.
Did you inform the FBI that Breasia Terrell was in that Impala?
In the initial phases, yes.
Okay. What evidence did you have that she was actually physically inside that Impala?
Just statements
From who?
from Andrea Culberson.
And what did Andrea Culberson say that allowed you to conclude that Ms. Terrell was inside in that car?
So as far as being directly inside, I don't recall her being specific as you're saying. The inference of her standing next to the car, and then at the same time Henry Dinkins left, she was no longer standing by the car, and Henry Dinkins and Breasia Terrell were both gone, as well as the maroon Impala.
Okay. So that was the leap in logic that you made, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now you understand that because of that inference, that assumption, the FBI did not do certain tests on the inside of that Impala, correct?
Which tests?
For DNA.
In a matter of it being a car that you would be familiar with, certain forms of DNA would be appropriately in those areas.
Well, assume for a minute that Breasia Terrell, we're trying to put her inside that Impala. You would want, first of all, in your training and experience, to be able to place her inside that car, would you not?
I would.
And if we don't have any eyewitness testimony or statements that absolutely put her in that car, we would want some physical evidence to put her in that car, would we not?
We would.
And if she hadn't ridden in that car before, DNA evidence would be helpful to put her in that car, right?
It would.
So, are you now aware that the FBI did not test that car for any DNA evidence apart from blood and semen?
I guess I'm not sure what forms of substances that we're getting at.
Sweat, tears, saliva,
That's what I'm saying.
skin cells.
That's what I'm trying to say. They didn't get none of this information, none of this evidence that they could have pulled from him. They took statements. They could have got anything from this man. They didn't. Why?
Any form of DNA.
Thank you.
So in my experience of collecting DNA, there are a few bodily fluids that contain, I guess, the DNA integrity far more than others.
So we don't try?
I don't.
And those reports said we did not test for DNA other than blood and semen, right?
Yes, I do.
Did it ever occur to you to communicate back with them and say, why don't we try for other types of DNA now?
With them being the experts in the standard of it there, it was all left to them.
Okay. Same thing with trace evidence. What's trace evidence?
So with respects to trace evidence, it can be different samples of hair, it can be skin flakes, it can be a multitude of different things expelled from the human body.
And once again, if we don't have eyewitness testimony or some other testimony that puts Briasia in that car, trace evidence can be very valuable, can it not?
It can be if it's possible to be used, and we have a very low to no success rate of trace evidence being developed with the profile.
So once again, we don't try.
That's on the FBI. That was all part of their investigation.
But you saw the reports from the FBI that said they didn't test for trace evidence in that Impala, right?
I did.
Did you think to maybe call back your contact at the FBI and say, hey, maybe we should be looking for Briasia Terrell's hair, skin particles, something else?
I had several communications with our local agent, Cameron Smith, about things that I felt were missed through a couple different processes by them. And they remained at the level the FBI left it at.
So the FBI decided not to test, is what you're
Yes.
saying? Okay.
What? Why?
You testified you sent certain items off to the DCI to be tested for bleach, right?
Yes,
So I can assume that the DCI at least has the capabilities to test items for the presence of bleach, right?
yes.
Is it fair for me to assume then that the FBI has the same capability?
I would imagine so.
Did anyone ask the FBI to test any item that was sent there for the presence of bleach?
I don't know specifically what's in all of those reports. Their evidence requests were made and completed by FBI agents.
Would you have preferred to see items tested for bleach if you would have made those requests?
Yes, I would.
And that's because the assumption is that Mr. Dinkins killed evidence, DNA type evidence, physical type evidence with bleach, right?
It's a possibility.
And would you agree with me, being the kind of case agent in this case, that we have no evidence that bleach was used anywhere in this case?
Correct. There's no signs of it being revealed in any sort of test.
Okay.
I don't understand, man.
So just to summarize, we have no DNA at all putting Briasia Terrell in that car, right?
Correct.
You okay?
I think so.
We're all just,
No blood, no semen connecting either Briasia Terrell to Henry Dinkins or vice versa.
Correct.
You were involved in some interviews of this young boy named DL, right?
Yes.
Now, by the time you were involved with interviewing him, how many times had he been interviewed prior?
I had him in a vehicle ride with Detective Hammis. And I believe at that point, he had had 2 structured interviews
Okay.
prior to that.
And you reviewed those interviews prior to taking him on the ride?
I had summaries given to me by the people who did them.
So the summaries you were given in the interviews prior, he had not talking about any bloody machete in those first 2 interviews, had he?
There's 2 different things there. I guess you're asking if I can clarify it.
Sure.
I had information that he saw a machete and then it was wiped off.
Okay. But you have information that he made that disclosure to Detective Hammis, right?
Yes.
And you also had information that when he made that disclosure to Detective Hammis, she dug a little deeper into how he knew that, right?
Yes.
And he told her that he was told, DL, by an officer downtown about the bloody machete, right?
I don't remember the exact contents of that one.
Okay. Well, Detective Hammis, when she interviews people, she reduces that to a report, right?
Yes.
And she's a good report writer, right?
She is.
Very thorough, right?
Yes, she is.
And if that's in one of her reports, we can rely on that as likely being true.
I would.
Okay, we can talk to her about that, and we will. He also, DL, talked about Credit Island. Did you go with him to Credit Island?
On the day that I was with him, yes.
Did it turn out that Credit Island really had any relevance to this investigation?
Not with respect to the overall discovery, other than the phone records and video shows they were in the area of Credit Island.
Did he talk to you about Henry going fishing there?
No.
Did he tell you that Henry got out and there were 6 people there?
At Credit Island?
Yes.
I don't recall it if there was.
Okay. But that'd be a detail that, had he told you, you'd likely remember. Is that a fair statement?
Yes,
You'd want to know if other people were present, and you note that, right?
I would, yes.
And how did it happen that DL wound up north on 61 going toward Clinton?
The area north of Scott County is an area that I wanted to explore for purposes of his memory recollection. I'm referring to DL, based off of the cell phone ping at the Comanche, Iowa, which is adjacent to Clinton, just on the south side of it.
Okay, so DL didn't direct you that route. It was officers having knowledge of phone pings taking him to the north side of Davenport, heading toward Clinton, right?
Yes, and in a full aspect of that, when Henry Dinkins and DL left the apartment just after sunup that morning, they were together, leaving there by statements of, in totality, how we came across DL later that morning, and by Andrea Culberson saying that DL left with his father in those early daylight hours. And then vehicle surveillance shows the maroon Impala traveling north out of the city of Davenport, and goes by a couple different highway cameras. So that creates that distance north where DL would likely be in the vehicle, and it's going towards the direction of the Comanche phone ping that we had knowledge of by the time that took place.
Well, sure, and I understand all that. But what I'm saying is, this little boy didn't say, hey, we need to go north of town toward Clinton. It was officers who put him in the car and started heading that way as the basis for going toward Clinton, right?
Correct.
And DL had no memories of going out toward Clinton on 61 until you guys start driving that way, right?
Correct.
And at this point, this is the 3rd time he's been interviewed. He still hasn't said anything about going to Walmart, has he?
I don't believe so.
Right.
Don't
Now, as you go north toward Clinton on 61, you seem to put some stock in the fact that he makes a comment in passing about you need to keep going when you turned east toward Clinton, right?
He did make that comment, yes.
Why didn't you keep going?
For me at that point in time, I knew of the Walmart and I knew where the phone ping came from. And I believe that to be something that would be the freshest for a memory recall event, to get in an area that would most likely be factually rememberable.
Well, because he's told a couple different stories at this point, you'd agree, right?
Different, yes. Some things not flowing.
Right. So at this point, you're having a hard time figuring out what he's saying that's credible and what he's saying that's not credible. Is that a fair statement?
Mixed with confusion, yes.
Okay. Did he tell you he fell asleep in that Impala at any point in time?
I don't recall if he did or not.
What's wrong with him?
When he got him to the Walmart, did he have a recollection of going to Walmart?
Yes, he did.
So it's that point in time when you drive him to this Walmart, he says, oh yeah, I remember I was here now, right?
He did.
And it was at that time he says, oh yeah, now I remember playing with Dad's phone, right?
Yes.
But it wasn't until then that he coughed up the information about the phone and saying very specifically, I took the battery out and put it back in because I was worried about getting in trouble, right?
Correct.
Now, did you interview him after that ride at all?
No. I mean, there's conversation in the car, but as far as an interview structure, no.
So after Briasia remains were found, you had a conversation with Aisha Langford, right?
We had several, yes.
You had one where you told her that there was a break in the case, and then finally that Aisha had been recovered, correct?
Briasia.
I'm sorry, Briasia, I'm sorry, right?
Yes.
And you told her that Briasia had been shot, right?
I did.
And you did that just with Aisha in the room. Is that fair?
Aisha was there. I think she had one other family support person. I had also reached out to our advocacy partners who had been with us a couple different times and looking, I don't know if they were there at that moment or not, or just on their way.
Point is, DL wasn't in the room.
He was not in that room. He was in his bedroom, which is just next to that area.
DL is a precocious young boy at that point, right?
Yes,
Kind of rambunctious.
very.
Okay. Did you get a call from Aisha in the weeks following that disclosure, but before Mr. Dinkins' arrest, that DL now had new information?
Yes.
What was that information?
He had been saying that he saw his dad shoot his sister.
So did you take a report on that?
We met with DHS, who filed a report on it, and we had conversations about that.
With DL?
Ain't none in the back.
And Aisha together.
What DL tell you?
He said that I'm paraphrasing a little, the gist of it was he had looked back and he made some motion of bang, bang, bang of some sort. And it was his dad shooting his sister.
Did you put any credibility in that?
It was very low to no to me,
Why do you say that?
based on the fact that he heard the conversation that I had with his mother. I had no other ways of corroborating what that was at that point in that phase of the investigation. And there was nothing else to go off of at that point to rule that statement credible or uncredible.
Did he at any point talk to you about being at the scene where supposedly he saw his dad shoot his sister and have him pour bleach on the bushes?
The conversations that I've been a part of, he talked about being there and seeing his dad go down into the wooded area to use the bathroom. And he had this machete with him. And when he came back out of the woods, he wiped it off and put it back in the trunk. And that was the best details that I heard from him.
So he said he wiped the machete off in the wood, or had to come out of the woods, not at Schmidt Road?
From my recollection, it was wiped off as he was putting it in the trunk. And then they had later driven that morning down around the Credit Island area, came back to the motorhome, and then it was transferred from the trunk to the inside of the motorhome.
But he never said anything about his dad getting out of the car on a gravel road and pouring bleach in the bushes.
I do not recall any of that, no.
If that were testified to here at trial, that'd be the first time you heard it.
Yes.
So there was discussion about this machete and your vast knowledge of the city of Davenport maintenance. Have you ever used a machete?
Yes.
Have you ever tried to cut a less than 1 inch round piece of brush or twig with it just by smacking it?
My only experience with it is tall, I call it wheatgrass, tall straw type material is all I've done with one.
Did you inspect the machete in this case?
I did not look at that one up close. It was packaged for evidence processing.
In your view of it, though, did it appear to be still sharp? And
From the pictures I saw, I noted to be one that I had not seen before. It was serrated on one side and then had a ground knife edge on the other.
Didn't appear to be one with heavy use.
Not from what I saw.
So I'm just trying to picture how this physically would have been accomplished. First of all, as I understand it, where Briege's remains were found, that's where she was killed. Is that a fair statement?
I don't know that anybody can discern that.
Okay. So Mr. Dinkins would have had to have been armed with a gun, assuming this is true, that she was killed right there. Have a 10-year-old girl with him, keep her under. If the state's intimation is right, chopping branches with a machete to get through the brush, right?
It's not the theory that I necessarily view with it.
Okay, that's fair. And when Briege's remains were found, the 4X T-shirt was still, the best we could tell, on her body.
Yes, with the exception of it probably being tugged by animals and things like that.
And the bra was still on her body. And the shorts were still on her body.
Yes.
So she had not been, even by animals, rodents, birds, whatever, disrobed.
No.
And the results of testing on those items when they were sent to the DCI lab, no bleach was found.
Correct.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Ms. Cunningham?
Thank you. Sergeant Pfeiffer, you keep being asked questions about no bleach being found. Is that actually an accurate statement relative to the submissions to the DCI lab based on your review of their reports?
I guess with respect to which piece?
Well, for example, with the passage of time, with the exposure of clothing to the elements, does that pose difficulties in being able to test for the presence of bleach?
Yes.
And was that a factor in this particular case?
Yes, I was told that it would be a very improbable amount of potential that bleach would be still detectable after the seasons of rain and snow that had happened during the time that Briege's body was in the elements.
So is that testimony that we need to wait and hear about from the criminalist who did the testing?
Yes.
All right. Now, Sergeant Pfeiffer, did you have a chance to visit with any of the FBI analysts from Quantico to speak with them about whether or not they even had the instrumentation to test for bleach?
Yes.
Okay. And let me ask you this. We've had a FBI analyst who has come in and testified about that particular topic. Should we rely on the testimony of the FBI analyst who spoke to that issue here in the courtroom?
Yes.
All right. And have you ever worked in a laboratory setting where you do any type of DNA analysis?
No.
Have you ever worked in a laboratory a setting where you do any type of trace evidence analysis?
No.
Have you ever worked in an FBI laboratory setting where you would test for different types of products, such as the presence of bleach?
No.
All right. So as far as the individuals who could speak to those issues, who are the individuals' testimony that we should rely upon for that?
The FBI criminalists and the criminalists from DCI.
Certainly. Taking that a step further, when items of evidence are submitted to the DCI laboratory, as a detective over the course of your 2 decades in law enforcement, have you made a number of submissions to the DCI laboratory to ask for items of evidence that are tested?
Yes.
Now, do you have a laundry list of items that you would like to have tested when you do submissions?
Yes.
But does that necessarily mean that the criminalists are going to test everything that you have requested?
No, they can be particular about certain areas of clothing, and there is a quantifiable amount of evidence that they have a standard on, and then variances can be authorized.
And so then therefore, do we need to rely on the testimony of the criminalists or the analyst who would speak to those issues and identify what items of evidence would be valuable for purposes of any type of testing that they do?
Yes, we do.
All right, now let's go back and let's talk about DL. You've been asked a lot of questions about things that DL had stated. Did you ever sit in on the interview that Detective Obert did of DL on July 10th?
No.
Okay. There was a transition from Detective Obert to Detective Maureen Hammis on July 10th, where she then did an interview of DL. Can you speak to that issue and why the child then was subsequently interviewed by Detective Hammis?
Other than a particular skill set, Detective Hammis is a certified child forensic interviewer, and she had many years of experience interviewing children. In our local Scott County trauma team, we had not always used forensic interviewers. At one time, the Davenport Police Department did a lot of those forensic interviews in-house. And so oftentimes Detective Hammis is tasked with some of those events, especially when they're rapid and evolving.
Certainly. And speaking to that topic, when the initial complaint came in, was the initial complaint ever viewed as an investigation of DL as being a child who had potentially been sexually abused or physically abused?
No.
All right. And so then at the initiation of the investigation, as far as what the perspective of law enforcement was when they started that initial conversation with DL, what was law enforcement trying to accomplish?
At that particular phase, law enforcement was trying to determine who were the people around. When was this child last seen, and were there any other dynamics taking place in the household leading up to this event?
Okay, so within that context then, in speaking with DL, was there, and I don't know if you would know this, but was law enforcement just trying to identify anyone that Breasia would have had contact with and just a simple timeline of events as they played out?
Yes, we worked on developing a timeline that would show even when the video game system was logged into, I don't remember the game they were playing at this point, but to try to establish the events that they had described playing.
Okay, let's talk about that particular subject matter. During the course of interviews was information provided by Andrea Culberson that both children had been playing video games at her residence.
Yes, there was.
And then while the children were present at her residence, did she have some type of gaming systems that at least one of the children had been using?
Yes, they did.
Okay, so was that gaming system yet another mechanism that was the subject of a search warrant and then processed to determine whether there was evidence which would confirm those reports? The children were playing video games.
Yes, I had one of our investigators conduct a search warrant with them to verify the internet connectivity through the IP address of that device logged into the server that the game was associated with. I don't know the particular names or platforms of it off the top of my head today, but those results came back and they did corroborate the fact that they were playing the game during at least the 9 p.m. hours that was explained.
All right. Was the perspective of law enforcement changing as we proceeded from the morning of July 10th through the evening of July 10th?
Yes.
So the initial perspective would have been what?
That Breasia woke up and wandered off.
Okay. And then as the day is proceeding, Mr. Dinkins is interviewed. Aisha Langford is interviewed. We've got the initial interview that Detective Obert has done of Detorius. Andrea Culberson is interviewed. And then we go to a more structured interview of DL. Do the dynamics of the investigation change?
Yes, there's a considerable amount of physical evidence sightings that are compiled early on in the evening hours of July 10th.
Okay. And then so by virtue of that, does that change the complexion of the investigation and then decisions made about doing a different structured type of interview with DL?
Yes.
All right. Now, did you sit in on any of the interviews that Detective Hammes did with DL?
I did not.
Actually, Detective Hammes, would she be the best person to speak to about any statements that DL had provided to her?
She would.
Okay. And then I'm just going to ask this question. It's a very simple yes or no. Were you aware of DL making statements to Detective Hammes about his father having taken bleach down by the water?
No.
All right. So is that a topic that we should talk with Detective Hammes about?
Yes.
I'd like to discuss with you the theory about the use of the machete and discussions we've had about brush that was located near the area of Briasia's remains. You were out there. Just based on what you saw, the brush that you noted had those clean cuts. What was the physical placement of that brush relative to the skeletal remains?
Directly over the area where
Okay.
the remains were.
And so with you seeing that brush with those clean cuts over the top of the skeletal remains, just based on your experience as a law enforcement officer, what did that suggest to you?
That branches were cut while they had full foliage on them and used for concealment of her body.
Okay, another topic of discussion. DL was how old at the time of this incident?
7 or 8.
Okay. For a child of 8 years old, based on video surveillance footage that was gathered, was that child taken to a number of different locations when he was with his father?
Yes, he was.
And was that verified through video surveillance footage?
Yes.
Now, recognizing that the child was taken out of Scott County to Clinton County, would they have had to have traveled some distance?
Yes.
Okay. Recognizing that the child then was brought back to Davenport down along the area of Credit Island and 743 Schmidt Road, was the child taken some distance?
Yes.
Okay. For an 8-year-old located in a vehicle, think of an 8-year-old and their stature and their ability to be able to sit high in view out of the windshield, does their size tend to restrict what it is that they're able to see?
Yes, it can.
Okay. Did you have a chance to review that video footage from the Walmart where Mr. Dinkins is pulling out and we can see that child sitting there in the front passenger seat of the vehicle?
Yes, I have.
All right. And then just based on your observations, if you could give us a perspective of that child and his size relative to what would be his perspective related to the dash passenger window or even looking at the windshield. Speak to that topic if you would for me.
It's probably an unfair camera angle. These are higher mounted cameras, so you're looking down at more of a bird's eye view into that windshield. But you can discern that there is a smaller person with a white shirt on that remains in the passenger seat while Henry Dinkins goes inside.
Okay. Are you a father?
I am.
And then, of course, when you think about your children at that age, did you have any of your children ever sit in the front seat of your vehicle at that age?
Objection, relevance.
Your Honor, I think it's very relevant for purposes of perspective.
Sustained.
Have you ever been in a vehicle with a child that age?
I have.
Okay. And when you stop and consider the size of a child in the front passenger seat, would you agree with me that their ability to be able to see out is going to be completely different than your ability to be able to see out?
Yes.
All right. Now, as far as going to Clinton, was Mr. Dinkins inside that Walmart for a significant period of time? And when I say significant, more than a minute or so.
Yes, I believe it was maybe 10.
Okay. And based on the video surveillance footage, was that child then inside that car the entire time?
Yes.
All right. With an 8-year-old child being in a vehicle, are you able to account for that child's movement around the vehicle?
Not on the inside of the vehicle.
All right. So, just when you think about various circumstances, the typical, human, evaluation of an incident. You've got an 8-year-old child in the vehicle. So just by saying that you've got an 8-year-old child in the vehicle, the passenger seat, is it natural just to assume that that child just sat there and did nothing else?
Objection calls for speculation.
It doesn't call for speculation.
Sustained.
Speaking to the topic of an 8-year-old, do you have to consider the possibility that child may be moving about that vehicle?
You could consider it.
Certainly. So let's go back to the topic of DL and the question of various statements that he made. With every statement that he made through the course of various interviews, did law enforcement take that information and use that as a basis for evidence that they searched for throughout the entirety of the investigation?
Yes.
And with respect to the child's statements, was there either physical evidence or video surveillance footage that was captured that corroborated what that child said?
Yes.
Okay. As, a detective involved in this investigation, by the amount of independent evidence that was collected, that would,
Material, whether or not he was surprised.
Your Honor, this goes specifically to questions that counsel had asked the witness to suggest that this child was making statements all over the place and you couldn't view the child as credible.
The objection's overruled.
So as far as being surprised, I don't know that's the right phrase for it, but
Go ahead.
the statements were verified by all of those different comparisons of either optical viewings and surveillance or physical evidence recovered based off of statements made.
Okay. With any investigation, when individuals make statements to law enforcement, what does law enforcement do with those statements?
We try to fact check them, and I'm not surprised when people tell the truth, but it has to be verified as much as possible to come to some conclusion of if the statements are valuable or not.
All right. Okay. One final topic of discussion involves counsel's questions to you relative to the discovery of the skeletal remains and the clothing there about the body. Counsel asked you whether or not the child was disrobed at that point in time. Do you recall that question?
I do, I'm sorry.
All right. With Mr. Dinkins being down in the area of 743 Schmidt Road, prior to the 3 o'clock hour, when Andrea Culberson woke up and discovered Mr. Dinkins gone and Briasia gone, can we account for what happened inside that RV when he went in and stayed for a period of 10 minutes on 2 separate occasions?
No.
But do we know that Briasia is not in that apartment as of 3 a.m.?
Yes, we do.
And so is it significant that Mr. Dinkins, in his interview, never mentions being down in the area of that RV and Credit Island between the 2 and 3 o'clock hour?
He never mentions it.
Okay. Is it significant then that based on time elements, there's a vehicle entering on Credit Island and coming off of Credit Island during that 2 to 3 o'clock time frame?
I believe it is.
Okay. Is it also significant that after Andrea Culberson saw the child standing there by the passenger side of the Impala at 3:30, she sees Mr. Dinkins leaves, looks out, the vehicle's no longer there, Mr. Dinkins is no longer there, and Briasia is no longer there. But we have him up at the quick shop at 3:32 a.m. where he's making purchases and purchasing gas and leaving at 3:38 a.m. Can we account for what would have transpired between that time frame and then when he showed back up at the apartment prior to 5:50 a.m. to pick up Detorius?
No, we cannot.
Okay. Now, was there evidence that was gathered in the course of the investigation that would have tied Mr. Dinkins to the location where Briasia's remains were recovered before 5:50 a.m. and after that 3:38 a.m. time frame on July 10th?
Yes.
And that evidence is what?
Jared Brinks was driving to work on that morning of July, and he came forward and described a subject jumping up in the middle of the median on Highway 61, adjacent to the Kunal implement, and Jared Brinks pulled over, offered assistance. He described this individual matching the description of Henry Dinkins, and that he was stuck off the side of the road, and Jared Brinks put him in his truck, drove him over to the location where the maroon Chevy Impala had gone off the side of the road a little bit. Jared Brinks explained that he hooked a chain front corner underneath the Impala, hooked it to his truck, pulled it out. He said that the individual offered him $100 for that, which he said he didn't receive, and he drove off and went to work, which he works down here southwest of Davenport in a little town called Buffalo.
All right. Was Jared Brinks' cell phone then submitted to the FBI lab with our special agent, Richard Fennerin, doing the processing of that cell phone to identify its location during the early morning hours of July 10th?
Yes, it was.
All right. And was that phone located hitting off cell phone towers in that area after 3:38 a.m. and before 5:50 a.m. when Mr. Dinkins came back to the apartment?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And is that testimony we're going to be hearing about?
Yes.
I have no further questions.
Sir, the clothing of Briasia Terrell showed no evidence of being sliced with a machete, did it?
None that could be detected, no.
Showed no evidence of being cut with any sharp object at all, did it?
No.
It was all intact, right?
For the most part, yes.
And it had no blood on it, did it?
Not that was detectable.
And that's a fact that was not corroborated of DL's, was it?
I'm not aware of him talking about her being bloody in my interactions.
Okay. Well, the machete would have gotten bloody somehow. We can assume that was from Briasia, right?
I don't have that information to provide.
Now, the investigation and interviews of DL, it's very important to keep them pristine and just very, very untainted, right?
As much as possible.
But you'll agree that his story that he was present when his sister got shot came directly from you.
I believe so.
Okay. You mentioned something about it was important in that first day to kind of understand the dynamics of what was going on in the home in response to council's questions about DL. Expand on that for me. What do you mean?
So, and not in a negative fashion is my context of that. Anytime there is an event in a household, especially if someone runs away or there are circumstances where the dynamics and the composition of everybody that's home changes for some sort of reason, we try to isolate and separate those people to try to get the best feel for what was the temperature of the evening. Were there arguments between the adults and did that scare kids and make them go hide? That happens sometimes. Were there just other arguments, or was everybody just having a great time and it's just completely unexplainable? And so that's what I'm referring to by trying to capture that.
In the dynamics in Henry Dinkins' household leading up to the evening of July 10th was everybody was getting along and having a great time, right?
Yes.
Council talked about the DCI report and the bleach. The fact is, there's no bleach detected, right? I don't care the reason.
Right.
And council talked about you submitting things for all these years to the DCI, and perhaps they don't test for it. It doesn't stop you from submitting items, right?
That's correct.
Your job is to collect evidence and ask to have it tested. They do what they want, right?
Correct.
And you may think something that's relevant and you may want it tested, but they do what they want, right?
By their standards, yes.
Right. So that's what you did in this case. You thought bleach might be there, and they thought for whatever reason they may not find it, so they didn't test for it on certain items, right?
Correct.
In fact, they did test the white bottle that they thought would contain bleach possibly, and there was no bleach in it.
Right.
Okay. What we do know for a fact, however, is that the DCI, our Iowa State Criminalistics Laboratory, is someone you deal with regularly, right?
Yes.
Weekly?
Yes.
What we do know is that all the evidence that was sent off to the FBI crime lab was sent off to them within maybe a week or two of Breasia Terrell's disappearance. We can agree on that.
Yes.
And it was back in Davenport PD's possession, I'm going to say no later than October 1st, 2020. We agree on that.
It'd be close.
What prevented you or anyone else at Davenport PD from sending off that evidence that wasn't tested for bleach at the FBI, assuming for sake of argument that the nation's top crime lab can't test for bleach, okay? Sending that off to Ankeny, like the cuttings from the Impala, for instance, and say, hey, DCI, we think we should test for bleach because maybe Henry Dinkins bleached out the inside of his car. Sending it off to the DCI and saying, please test. What stopped the Davenport Police Department from doing that?
Discussions with the command staff in our ID and Evidence Bureau. They took a position that they were not going to re-examine things that were sent to the FBI, whether there was a conflict or they were not tested. The two entities were going to be responsible for their own independent results and not cross paths. Not a decision of mine, but that is a decision that was made at that time.
So up the chain.
Yes, sir.
So you're telling me that we didn't have a test for bleach from the FBI, and someone up the chain at the Davenport PD says, we aren't going to test for it because we don't want to step on toes at the FBI?
Semantically, that's close. What was decided is that what this lab determined to be factual in their examination was going to remain at that lab, and that we weren't going to pin different lab technicians against one another.
Even if it wasn't tested for? That was the decision?
But those